Jamie Stonemaier and Stonemaier Games has sued the Trump administration. Well, at least they joined the lawsuit that's suing the Trump administration over the whole Liberation Tariffs thing. And well, this is the complaint right here. Lawsuits against the government are public information, so let's break this thing down just a little bit right here. And the legal firm or legal action committee behind this lawsuit is these guys, the Pacific Legal Foundation. And to be honest, no one's really a big fan of lawyers, but the libertarian part of my political consciousness really likes their tagline, suing the government since 1973. All right, let's take a look who's actually involved in this lawsuit, both the plaintiffs as well as the defendants. Of course, here is Stonemaier LLC, that's the gaming company we're interested in, and there are some other tabletop game companies down here, but not all of these people are in the tabletop game industry, and we'll point out some of that in a little bit. When it comes to the defendants, well, they're a mixture of departments of the United States government. Here's the United States Customs and Border Protection, as well as some kind of high-profile people, including Kristi Noem, Secretary of Department, Homeland Security, and of course, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. To recap, all these tariffs come from President Trump using the International Economic Emergency Powers Act to implement them. The first one in regards to China dealt with the accusation that they are taking precursor chemicals that are then being turned into fentanyl by the drug cartels and smuggled into the United States. The second national emergency was pertaining to a large trade deficit between the United States and other countries, and this is the one that triggered most of that 145% tariff thing you saw for a while until the 90-day pause went in, and this is primarily what triggered the lawsuit from Stonemaier Games and other people. So let's take a quick look at some of the companies that are involved in this lawsuit. Now, of course, here we have Platent Stonemaier LLC is a Missouri limited liability company. It is a tabletop game publisher based in St. Louis. Its games are distributed worldwide, and Stonemaier is perhaps best known for its renowned game Wingspan. Stonemaier has printed all of their products over the last 13 years at a factory in China owned by Panda Game Manufacturing, a Canadian company, a process that started before the tariffs were imposed. Stonemaier has imports ready to ship on which it estimates it will pay millions in tariffs pursuant to actions challenged herein. Stonemaier anticipates future orders of games to be printed in China that will also be subject to tariffs levied pursuant to actions challenged herein. So that's the summary about Stonemaier. Another company here is Princess Awesome LLC, is a Maryland limited liability company that makes children and adult clothing with the intention that all individual human beings deserve to be seen, ... That's just talking about a company we're not super interested in. Then also you've got this company, 300 Below Inc., an Illinois corporation that develops and deploys an innovative process to freeze metal parts to extend their life. The point of showing you those two is that not everybody involved in this lawsuit is a tabletop game company. Then we do have some other tabletop related game companies. We have Spielcraft Games LLC. We've got Rookie Mage Games LLC, XYZ Games Labs Inc., and Tinkerhouse Inc., which I guess makes some sort of tabletop role-playing game accessory. Sounds great, guys. When it comes to suing the government in the United States, you can't just sue them whenever you feel like it for any given reason, hoping to get some sort of a payout. You have to have what is called standing. Now, at this point, I should mention that I am not a lawyer, but I do love following some of these lawsuits and learning a little bit about them. And the super really dumbed down, simplified version of standing is that you had to have A, been hurt by the federal government in some way, and the federal government must have a way to actually remedy that situation. Usually that's by paying you lots of money, or possibly if you were like imprisoned unconstitutionally, they may, terminate your prison sentence and clear your record, things like that. So there are some restrictions when it comes to when you can actually sue the federal government. In the case of tariffs here, what you probably have to see is companies that have already paid the tariffs, and therefore they have already been hurt by the government by being forced to pay these, what they claim to be unconstitutional taxes. Let's take a bit of a look into the standing section for this lawsuit. We see here on page 8 that plaintiffs King Seal, Spielkraft, and Rookie Mage have already paid tariffs imposed pursuant to actions challenged herein. Plaintiffs Princess Awesome and King Seal were invoiced by Customs for a tariff imposed to pursuant actions challenged herein. And then if we jump down to the part about Stonemaier, we see that plaintiffs Stonemaier, some other companies, each have products that have been produced or are in production that they plan to import to the United States on which they expect to pay tariffs pursuant to actions challenging herein. When it comes to standing, the position that you're in where it's like, I want to do this thing that's going to get me hurt by the government or get me in trouble, therefore I'm going to sue the government before I do this thing, is historically usually not good enough to give you standing to sue the federal government. So in this case, where Stonemaier hasn't actually paid any tariffs yet, or hasn't started the process of going through the tariffs, or got any sort of large bill from the government for the tariffs, in my amateur opinion, I don't think they have very good standing right at the moment, and it is possible that once this lawsuit gets into the court system, they will basically get dropped as a plaintiff. But some of these other companies which have already paid tariffs, well, they might actually go ahead and have their part of the lawsuit get through and end up in the courts system and being allowed to sue the federal government. In a moment here, we'll take a look at the claims being made by the lawsuit, but first I want to show you guys what'll soon be a new miniature coming out for my 3D printable Fractured Colony miniature line. Of course, this guy right here is the Griffin. He's been out for a few years, and you can get his STL files over at fracturedcolony.com. And this one right here is an alternative version of the Griffin, which carries several anti-aircraft missiles. And this one will be part of an upcoming crowdfunding campaign for my third set of Fractured Colony miniatures later this summer. When it comes to the claims of the lawsuit here, there's a lot of information in this particular document, but the summary on page 2 gets a pretty good idea of what the plaintiffs are going for. First, the President's executive orders purport to rely for authority on the International Economic Powers Act, which is the two things that I referenced earlier at the start of the video, which grants certain authorities to the President to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat with respect to a declared national emergency, details, while the IEEPA authorized the President to take a number of significant actions, the imposition of tariffs is not among them. Fortunately, this particular act is actually pretty short, and we can take a look at some of the relevant sections right here. So the top of the act right here, you're going to see that phrase, unusual and extraordinary threat, which I'm assuming is something that's probably been defined in other court cases, but I guess we'll find out pretty shortly. And then down under grant of authorities, this first section seems to do a lot about foreign currency. Now this B part right here kind of gives the President a lot of broad powers when it comes to controlling international commerce in regards to one of these national emergencies. And as the lawsuit correctly points out, tariffs are not specifically mentioned in this particular section. Now you do see the term regulate right here, and you do see importation and exportation of and dealing of ... So the question comes in, even though tariffs are not mentioned here, can the President still actually authorize tariffs under this particular act? And we'll get back to that part in just a moment. Let me read the rest of this summary. Second, the national emergencies declared by the President do not constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat as required by the IEEPA, rendering therefore any tariffs imposed pursuant to the IEEPA unlawful. But if the court finds that the IEEPA does authorize these tariffs, then the IEEPA transfers Congress's legislative power under Article 1, Section 8 to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to the President in violation of the U.S. Constitution. So there's three things right here. We'll talk about the first one and the last one. The second one about unusual and extraordinary threat. That's a bunch of legal precedent that I don't have time to talk about in this video. And if I reach back here for my handy dandy copy of the U.S. Constitution, we can take a look at Article 1, Section 8. Section 8, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts, ... Essentially, the idea is that it's the job of Congress to raise revenue for the country and not the president. Unfortunately, there has been a bit of a somewhat recent, as in, I don't know, maybe the last 100 years or so, of slowly transferring power granted to Congress by the Constitution over to the president. And that's the third point. This lawsuit is arguing that even the president has the authority under the IEEPA to issue new tariffs. Well, that whole thing is completely unconstitutional. More on that in a little bit. And there's one more interesting piece in the particular lawsuit I want to look at, which is kind of right below where I just read. Not long after the Constitution's ratification, the Supreme Court affirmed that the powers to impose tariffs and the power to regulate commerce are substantive and distinct from each other. So if we're taking a look at this particular ruling right here, where we saw the word regulate in the IEEPA, this would seem to strongly suggest that the Supreme Court says when the president can regulate the economy or regulate economic activities, they are not being granted the power to impose tariffs. So if the Supreme Court references this particular decision, they may actually throw out Trump's tariffs. At least that's what the plaintiffs are hoping right here. Now, if you want to do some fun reading, the U.S. Congress actually has a document that's a really long history on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and how it's been used over time. And it is a really, really long document talking about its history, some of its amendments. We have this chart right here that kind of shows various emergency declarations and whether they had anything to do with the IEEPA or not. But at the very end of this document, we get a little bit on the topic of tariffs. Now, I should point out this document was written before the second Trump administration, so this line I'm about to read is indeed out of date, but it is relevant to the case at hand. No president has used the IEEPA to place tariffs on imported products from a specific country or on products imported to the United States in general. However, the IEEPA's similarity to the TWEA, coupled with its relatively frequent use to ban imports and exports, suggests that such an action could happen. The TWEA is the Trading with Enemies Act, which is from 1917, and the reason why that's relevant, it's essentially a precursor to the IEEPA, and at one point, it was likely used by President Nixon to impose tariffs. So right here is Proclamation 4074 by President Richard Nixon. And when it comes to this particular document, when you read about it online, all the commentary says this document is referencing the Trading with Enemies Act, but you'll notice it doesn't actually specifically reference that particular act anywhere. These statutes all deal with tariffs. However, what I think they're talking about is right here on page, I guess it'd be 927 of whatever document this is from. I hereby declare a national emergency during which I call upon the public and private sector to make efforts necessary to strengthen the international economic position of the United States. Therefore, this line here where President Nixon was declaring a national emergency, he is referencing the Trading with the Enemies Act, and that's why people say this is relevant. And this entire proclamation, 4074, ends up essentially applying a 10% duty on a whole bunch of different products coming into the United States. That is an argument there for why the Supreme Court may allow these tariffs that President Trump has implemented. But let's talk a little bit about what are some of the possible rulings. Are they likely? And I guess what would their effects be? As a general rule, courts in the United States like to keep rulings relatively narrow because they don't want to rock the boat all that much. Granted, there have been some pretty sweeping rulings in the history of this country, but for the most part, those are the exceptions and not the common rule. Therefore, the ruling is going to most likely apply to whether the IEEPA allows the president to impose tariffs or not. And well, I'll let the lawyers and the legal system sort that one out. However, a lot of people like to look at the Supreme Court right now, see that it's got a conservative majority, and several of the justices have been appointed by President Trump during his first term, and that immediately causes them to conclude that this court is going to allow the tariffs, but the honest reality is I don't think it's that certain. However, some of the justices are a bit of a wild card, like Amy Coney Barrett, and they don't always side with the president, and therefore a ruling in favor of Trump and his tariffs are not 100% guaranteed in this case. The third claim in this lawsuit was that the IEPA is completely unconstitutional because what it does is it transfers some of Congress's constitutionally granted authority over to the president, and that is unconstitutional and should not be allowed. And I wish the ruling would be that that is the case, to where we go back to something that's more akin to how the Constitution says our country should operate. But honestly, that's probably not going to happen. That would be a massive ruling to say that Congress cannot delegate its congressional power over to the presidency, because practically that horse is way out of the barn, over the hills, and probably got run over on the road a while back by some large semi-truck. So it's not coming back. If it did, the ramifications for this country would go way beyond tariffs and way beyond economic national emergencies, because it would essentially mean that the last 60 plus years of United States military activity has been completely illegal. And that would create all sorts of fun situations to resolve. And there's a little bit of sarcasm there, Kate, you couldn't tell. So yeah, I guess we'll find out here in the not too distant future what's going to happen. Most of these cases are being escalated up to the Supreme Court in an emergency fashion. So this one, even if it's not this lawsuit in particular, there's plenty of others out there filed by other people that are similar. So one of these will probably end up in the Supreme Court's docket not too far in the future. And on the day that I'm recording this, you may have saw a news story that, well, one federal court ruled that Trump's tariffs were illegal and they were cut off. And then the appeals court immediately came back and said, yeah, they're in for now until this case is resolved. So things are still changing on a daily basis. Anyway, thank you guys all for watching. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. We'll be breaking down some more. I don't know what I'll be doing next time, to be honest with you. There's some other crazy news stories about terrorists and tabletop gaming and getting into some controversies from the past. But anyway, remember to head over to fracturedcolony.com and keep an eye out for my latest crowdfunding campaign coming, I don't know, maybe another month or two, depending on how things get shaped out here. I've got 2 more miniatures to print out and finalize, and then I'll be just about ready to get this campaign underway. So, all right, I'll see you guys all next time.